Comparing imagery on stone items and ceramics is fairly standard practice in iconographical and iconological studies, but examining these materials with regard to the same function is rarely done. This paper looks at media at the crossroads in 5th century BC Athens, specifically at the meeting point of the living and the dead, funerary commemoration. Scholars point to Cicero's mention of a sumptuary law to explain the disappearance of funerary stelae in Attica in the early 5th century BC. This stelae then reappeared around 430 BC, a phenomenon that is usually credited to the Peloponnesian War or to the plague in 429, and to changing attitudes and practices toward honoring the dead. According to this line of thinking, the sudden dramatic rise in mortality on the battlefield and in the city may have driven families to begin erecting more elaborate monuments once again. In addition, the institution of the patrios nomos, the use of a common grave for the war dead in Athens around 470 BC, had consequences for private commemoration. According to this line of reasoning, the public ceremony deprived mourning families of the ability to honor their family members, who compensated for this lost opportunity by commemorating their loved ones by other means, that is, by Whiteground lekythoi. Other explanations for the suspension of production of stone stelae are economic. That is, the creation of the Themistoclean Wall in around 478 demanded every bit of stone available, as well as the stonemasons to shape it and put it in place. And building projects in Athens, beginning in the 460s in the Agora, also demanded an available labor force, and the later projects atop the Acropolis monopolized stonemasons for decades. Correspondingly, scholars posit a link between the hiatus in the production of stelae and the proliferation of Whiteground lekythoi. The Whiteground lekythoi began to appear around 500, then grew common around 470, when their use and iconography became exclusively funerary. Therefore, the thinking goes, the ceramic images served as substitutes for the stone stelae. As the production of stelae resumed around 430 to 420, the Whiteground lekythoi dwindled in number until the late 5th century, when the ceramic vessels were replaced by grave markers in the form of stone stelae and stone lekythoi, soon to be followed by stone lutrophoroi. This paper proposes that the stelae, in fact, never disappeared. We will leave aside stelae for the Demosion Sima, which are a different matter, and instead we will concentrate on private funeral markers, something of an oxymoron, since the funeral markers were seen by, and intended to be seen by, more than just the immediate family. I wish to argue that stelae did persist, but what changed was the medium. The costly stone stelae were replaced by more modest painted wooden examples, a proposal that has already been made by several other scholars in brief mentions, including Jutta Strotzek, who's sitting in the audience. Here I try to offer some evidence to support that idea. Furthermore, I think that the stone stelae reappeared around 430, partially as a response to the plague, but also because of larger socio-political reasons. The first part of this essay discusses the visual material, the stelae and lekythoi, while the second portion addresses the reasons for the resumption of stone stelae in the latter part of the 5th century BC. So, the first part. Archaic stone stelae in Athens took a variety of forms, including palmette stelae inscribed with the name of the deceased, as well as stelae with figural decoration, such as those you see here. Although horsemen and symposiasts, women, and the well-known brother and sister stelae appear on the carved sculptures, the vast majority of images are of athletes and soldiers, images that clearly invoke the elite patrons who memorialize their dead with these slabs. I think we might imagine that most well-to-do families would have marked burial plots with stone stelae, such as these, while only a few employed the larger and more costly koroi and korai, some of which stood on sculpted bases. As noted above, the stone stelae and funerary statuary in Athens ceased around 470. Was this change of practice due to the sumptuary law mentioned by Cicero? Cicero's text does not say that the law expressly forbade stone stelae, but that the law prohibited erecting a tomb that required more than 3 days' labor for 10 men. Although 3 days' labor for 10 men still sounds as if you could build a fairly ornate monument. Stucco work, herms, and private eulogies were forbidden, and the number of mourners was limited. Cicero is vague about when these new practices were instigated, and says only that it was sometime after Solon. That's a lot of possibility. Cicero goes on to describe the sumptuary law set forth by Demetrius of Phaleron in 317 BC, an act inspired by the increase in the extravagance of both funeral ceremonies and monuments. Scholars have proposed that the first law mentioned by Cicero was devised by Cleisthenes. That a law may have existed is plausible, but it is hard to believe that it was affected by Cleisthenes, since the monuments continued for some 40 years after he instituted his reforms in 508-7. And now to the Whiteground lekythoi. The vessels initially were used to deliver oil to the grave, where they were then placed in or on the grave, as we see here. And this is illustrated on Whiteground lekythoi themselves, like this one and many others. From around the mid-5th century BC on, the Whiteground lekythoi became too large to contain oil, but otherwise functioned in the same way. The imagery painted on the Whiteground lekythoi is of 4 main types: mistress and maid scenes, scenes at the tomb, often tendants of the tomb, prothesis scenes, and mythological imagery, including Haron, Hopnos, and Thanatos, as we see on the left here. Such images are mythological to us, of course, but Haron, Thanatos, and Hopnos were very real entities to the ancient Greeks. In most of the depictions at the tomb, a funerary monument, usually 1 stele or more, sometimes a more elaborate structure or precinct, is normally shown and is often the focal point of the action. Because the vase painters of Whiteground lekythoi were painting at a time when stone stelae were no longer being produced, we might ask ourselves, what were they painting? Some scholars regard the vase paintings as fantasies, and some elements of these images are undeniably so, such as the mythological figures. Others view the stelae painted on the lekythoi as inspired by the Demossian sima, or by stelae produced outside of Attica, for example, on the islands. A few scholars have proposed that the depictions represent actual stone stelae that continued to be erected for notable private citizens. Such dignitaries were buried at public expense in prominent locations in the Kerameikos in Athens, such as the tombstone for Pythagoras in the foreground here, an envoy to Athens from Selymbria who died and was commemorated by this grave monument of around 450 BC. This is the only such grave I know in Athens from the period around 470 to 430 BC. Vase painters may have been inspired by stelae outside of Attica, but one must then ask about the route of transmission. That stone stelae in the Demossian sima, seen here, the partial excavation, that these stone stelae in the Demossian sima influenced the painters of Whiteground lekythoi is hard to prove because of the lack of evidence for the period in question, around 470 to 430. The fragments of a vessel of around 450 depicting casualty lists suggests extreme simplicity and clear writing, which differs from the stelae painted on Whiteground lekythoi, which rarely, though occasionally, have writing indicated on them. In fact, many of the stelae painted on Whiteground lekythoi resemble actual Attic stelae that existed in the Archaic period, as we see here in this comparison of the lekythos and the stelae, such as this palmette-top stelae, which we see here. I have to take off my glasses for this, here and here. And these palmette-top stelae are very common on the Whiteground lekythoi. This makes the idea that painters were creating fantastic images, this appearance in both stelae and lekythoi, This idea that painters were creating fantastic images seems less credible, and we could point to many other elements of these vase paintings that reflect reality, such as the use of lekythoi on the tomb. They are lekythoi, not stamnoi or some other shape suited for a different use. If painters of Whiteground lekythoi were indeed painting images of real stone stelae, it could only have been from a distant memory. While there is no indication that the purported sumptuary law insisted on pre-existing tombs being destroyed, the archaic funerary stelae were no longer around to be seen around 470 because they had been yanked out of the ground to build the Themistoclean wall in 478 BC. Instead, I would suggest that vase painters were indeed painting real stelae not made of stone, but made of wood. Evidence for wood, leaving aside wooden stelae for the moment, is scarce in ancient Greece because of the poor conditions for preservation. But wooden stelae are well known from Egyptian and Near Eastern contexts. Wood finds of differing types of objects have been found at various Greek sites. These include boxes, bowls, plates, pinaces, sarcophagi, such as these fragments in Pella, and figurines. Wood survives in Attica itself. One can point to the extraordinary small objects from the sanctuary of Artemis at Brauron, including pinaces, once painted from the late 6th or early 5th century BC. And we know of choregic pinaces in Athens from the 5th century BC, such as that awarded to Themistocles in 476 for his tragic victory with Thrynikos, which may have been of wood. Not the victory, the plaque. These recall the wooden pizza plaques, of course, the wooden painted votive pinaces of the late 6th century, whose painting survives in such good condition. And there is written attestation of decorated votive pinaces elsewhere, for example on Delos. Remains of parts of ancient wooden furniture from the 6th century BC can be identified as such because of their correspondence to sculpted and painted images of furniture on contemporary objects. Legs of cleani painted on vases find their counterparts in wooden and ivory examples. So I'm talking about these images here, these pommettes and these volutes at the top, and we see something similar over here. And here we have an ivory cleine from the Kerameikos. Legs of cleini, excuse me. Especially noteworthy are the details shared across media, such as the pommette topping a volute. One sees it on vase paintings of furniture, in ivory furniture, and here's a comparison for you, and on the stelae painted on Whiteground lekythoi. So now a series of these pommettes and sometimes volutes on these Whiteground lekythoi. And we see it again here and here on the right. The motif appears in reality on stone stelae from the Archaic period, such as the one you see on the left, on stelae found outside of Attica, and those from Attica, as exemplified by this one on the left, and this other stelae from the National Museum as well. In other words, what I wish to argue is that the vase paintings of stelae on Whiteground lekythoi reflect something real. Furthermore, a number of the stelae painted on the Whiteground lekythoi possess lines, indicative of thin, closely spaced moldings, easily executed in wood. I'm talking about this here. And we see it again here, and here, and here, and here, and again here. The crisped, sharp-edged, incised ornament, and the division of the vertical slab by incised lines to indicate borders or moldings, such as those of the Calvert stele in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, of around 550 to 500 BC. I'm talking about these lines here. Not only recall painted and sculpted images of wooden furniture, but can be seen on actual wooden objects, such as this wooden pinox found in a level from the second half of the 7th century BC at the Haraion on Samos. And here a comparison. A small gable crowns the pinox, and its surface is framed by a low raised molding. And we can compare this raised molding with this here, and of course, the gable can be seen on stelae and on Whiteground lekythoi as well. The paintings of stelae on Whiteground lekythoi usually depict the lekythoi as perched on a base, as we see here. We no longer have the wooden grave stelae posited here, but are there remains of stone bases, which may have supported them. A fragmentary marble base, inscribed Asklepios Iyia, from the Keramikos has a shallow cutting for what Despinis believed was a wooden votive pinox framed by antae that supported a crowning device. Despinis dates the monument to the second half of the 4th century. While this is thought to be a votive dedication, and its date falls outside the time period under consideration here, the base offers evidence that wooden stelae inserted into stone bases existed in Athens in the classical period. This is one example, there may be others. When sculpted stone stelae resume in around 430, these same thin moldings are also present, and I refer to this at the top here, and also the moldings here just at the base of the gable, and also at the top of the pilasters here. These moldings are present, yet their form and iconography, that is, of the stelae themselves, exhibit marked changes from examples on Whiteground lekythoi and of archaic stone stelae. Soldiers and athletes still appear, but they are less common and now often accompanied by additional figures. The prominence of children and women is striking. Like the Whiteground lekythoi, the classical grave stelae do not portray mythological figures. Rather, the compositions are often farewell scenes, with one figure sometimes seated, presumably the dead, and at least one figure standing. The additional figures suggest family members, who signify additional mourners, but also heirs. In other words, these stone stelae continue one tradition from their archaic predecessor. They are self-representations of the elite. One of the most ubiquitous features of the stone stelae of around 430 and later are their architectural frames, pedimental aediculi, and furniture, elegant klizmoi and footstools, which are also common on Whiteground lekythoi. With archaic stelae out of view, one wonders about the inspiration for these details on the stone stelae. Of course, actual architecture provides the model, for the aediculi, for example. But my proposal would be that the wooden stelae and/or aediculi may have been the source for this feature of late 5th century and later Attic stone stelae. Such a wooden structure or stele would have been well within the means for 10 skilled men working 3 days. And I show you this late 19th century engraving of the Keramikos, where you can see that there are wooden enclosures around various of the stelae to protect them. And so I have in mind something like this, something quite simple. To sum up thus far, I would suggest that wooden stelae were used in the 5th century when stone stelae were no longer being made. In fact, I think that wooden stelae were always used. Stone stelae were expensive and certainly were not affordable to the vast majority of Athenians, and wood would have been an ideal substitute. Such wooden stelae may have been painted with the name of the deceased or with images, as is known to be the case for some classical Attic stone stelae, as demonstrated by Richard Posamentier. And both writing and images appear on the stelae painted on Whiteground lekythoi, but such examples are few. Now we turn to the second part of this paper, much shorter, concerning the question of why the elite resurrected the practice of erecting stone stelae in around 430. Thucydides' famous and harrowing account of the plague describes the social disorder, the anomia of Athens. Bodies lay unburied, avoided even by predatory animals. All previous burial rituals were broken, and bodies were buried as expediently as possible, bodies thrown onto someone else's funeral pyre, one corpse atop another, then set alight. Seeking sanctuary, the dead took shelter in temples, which filled with corpses as those unfortunate died. He continues on and records that those who previously had nothing suddenly inherited from the wealthy, and this sudden change in fortune encouraged a carpe diem mentality and lawlessness. Vivid testimony of this state of affairs is offered by two communal graves in the Kerameikos. One of these, which had been repeatedly disturbed, which you see here in diagram above and in image down below, held at least 150 dead, and the grave goods date around 430, suggesting a conjunction with the plague, which struck twice, once in 430-29 and again in 427-6 BC. The other grave, undisturbed, held 29 individuals and no grave offerings at all. The pottery in the fill gives a terminus postquem of around 430 BC. In this breakdown of social order, one can well imagine that the elite desired to set themselves apart from the chaos surrounding them. One clear way to assert their social rank would have been through the use of stone funerary stelae. This would scarcely be the only time in classical Athens when the elites tried to assert social control, whatever was happening politically. And of course, nearly every important politician in 5th century Athens was from this elite class. I have argued elsewhere that the proliferation of hunting imagery on Attic pottery at the start of the 5th century was an aristocratic response to the changes wrought by the introduction of the Cleisthenic reforms. And the citizenship law of 451 was a sop to aristocrats as a way of protecting the privileges of citizenship, including the privilege of distinction. The resumption of stone stelae expressed an elite desire to advance and distinguish themselves and their burials from those of their fellow citizens. This reasoning would also explain the differences in iconography used on the Whiteground lekythoi and the stone stelae. The lekythoi employ a broader range of themes, including mythological and more emotive imagery, while the stone stelae offer fewer and more restrained compositions. There is overlap in subject matter in the two media, for example, depictions of the presumably deceased seated or standing near the grave. But there are also subjects peculiar to each medium. As stelae came back into vogue and the ceramic lekythoi yielded to petrified versions, these stone lekythoi adopted and imitated the more formal language and social aspirations of the stone stelae. I would argue that another critical factor, the Peloponnesian War, helps to explain the reappearance of the stone stelae. The war put added strain on the city in terms of its finances. The situation necessitated a levy, or aisphora, of 200 talents on Athens' wealthy citizens in 428, according to Thucydides. The aisphora, which seems to have debuted on this occasion and was repeated several times thereafter, was an unusual development, a compulsory direct tax on the wealthy, in contrast to the earlier liturgy system, which had the patina of being voluntary and afforded the wealthy an opportunity of public display as a form of compensation for their financial outlay to benefit the common good. The institution of the aisphora was highly unpopular, to say the least, and seems to have stirred fears of even greater demands for egalitarianism. The result was the oligarchic coup of 411. Perhaps the reintroduction of stone stelae was meant to stake a claim on the part of the elite, and its tolerance may have helped soften this absolutely essential but burdensome tax. To conclude, the break in production of stone stelae around 470 was not a break in creating stelae, but in the medium used. Wood had been and continued to be used for funeral markers, and Whiteground lekythoi offers evidence of this. The allowance of stone stelae once again from 430 on was, according to the reasoning presented here, a means of negotiating social and economic tension at a critical moment in Athens' history. The city needed the financial support of its wealthy, and the wealthy clearly understood their position. Thank you very much.